Hi everyone, this week's topic is communication and collaboration. And this is one of those topics that it's kind of unusual to teach, particularly in an online space, because it's one of those things that's, again, a learn by doing thing. So what we can do in terms of, a video lecture, some resources and readings, is to basically flag some issues and to raise some things to think about. But it's very difficult to achieve an abstract academic knowledge of these things without putting them into practice. So these are two areas of practice that the only way to get to improve is to do it. And the best way to improve is to get meaningful feedback. And so you need to do it in an environment where it's a safe environment to do it, and where people are at least either trained or at least open to giving you good feedback. And the other part of that is you also have to be good at receiving feedback. And that's actually harder than giving feedback, in actually being open when someone says, this was something that I felt was a mistake, and not taking that personally and taking that as a personal attack, and being able to build on what people say. So, these are things that I can talk about in the abstract, but there's no substitution for actually doing it. And when I said about a safe space for experimenting and testing and getting feedback, that's what university is all about. And this is where you want to try some different skills, try to reflect on what you know and what you think you need to learn, and do that in this safe environment where there are not that many consequences. I mean, I know everyone's very anxious and very concerned about failing or not doing as well as they want with grades, but that's still a very safe environment compared to the world of work, where if you make a mistake, there's no extra lives, there's no do-overs. That's, results can be permanent. So, we often get very focused on this idea of assessment, and I understand why. We get very focused on this idea of being under this pressure. But what we forget is that university is also this time to experiment and to develop skills, because you have people who have your best interests at heart who are going to give you feedback, and people who are experienced in giving feedback, so hopefully are better at it than your average person off the street. And that means, get involved, get engaged, get into discussions, raise questions, raise questions in tutorials, talk in tutorials. Not a lot of people do. And I understand it's much easier to sit back and lurk, but you're also paying money for an experience that's to develop you, that you're then saying, well, I don't actually want to participate in that. And that's in many ways wasting the money and resources you put into it. All right, so a few discussions, I guess, around the issues that are flagged in the readings for this week. One of the big questions they talk about is plain English expression, and that's something that has been a bugbear for the lawyers for a long time, and it's certainly an issue for other parts of the justice system. The idea of the way that police communicate with people, particularly with citizens or suspects, has always been an issue of concern. And both lawyers and justice professionals tend to develop their own way of speaking, their own kind of language. And certainly, there's lots of examples of legalese, of the complicated and arcane way lawyers tend to express themselves, and certainly the same in the justice field as well. And, I'd recommend the TV series Wellington Paranormal, actually, for a TV series that really gets the police idiom and the police way of speaking. It's fantastic. I think it's on SBS. But there is that certain, when people are trained to think and to express themselves in a certain way, it does come across in a particular style, and at times we can emphasise that for comedic effect, both for lawyers, for police, less so. I'm not sure whether corrections people or community justice workers are seen to have the same sort of common language or cliches, but we certainly do have it for lawyers and police. All right, so the text does talk a lot about the plain English law movement, and that's been running in law schools for quite some time now. I feel sort of ambivalent about some of it because it's an area that some people are quite fanatical about, and the drive to reduce documents to very, very basic terminology can often be counterproductive, because law is in some ways a technical discipline, and in some ways the more you try and make things simple to understand, the more complex they become, because you get less exact in the way in which you express yourself. So certainly I wouldn't raise issues to you in terms of communication with lay people, communication with clients. In those cases, simplicity, clarity, understanding your audience, all those things are important. But I know that in the area of legislative drafting, it can be tricky, where if you could say something with two technical legal words, and then you'd have to replace that with two paragraphs that sort of talk around those legal words, sometimes you can get into trouble that way. And sometimes you lose the precision of those words, in the same way that, say, an engineer or a chemist or a microbiologist, if they were forced to use plain English, to use that expression, for all their official reports and the way in which they communicate with each other. A chemist saying, well, we take the red chemical that smells a bit funny, that smells a bit like rotten eggs, and we mix that with the blue chemical that smells a bit like cat pee, and we kind of mix those together and we see what happens. And if it goes a bit bubbly, obviously I'm exaggerating, but that can be a problem with, legal documents, that you can end up losing the precision in that. Often well-intentioned, but drive to avoid the use of technical language. That being said, the basic assertion is still very, very strong, that if you're communicating with clients, you're communicating with ordinary people, that retreating into legalistic language is problematic. And quite often it's done in a sense of lack of confidence, and a way of putting a sense of distance between the speaker and the audience. So that, if you can bamboozle them with lots of technical terms and technical phrases, you can actually create this sort of illusion of professional expertise, because you're using all the big words, when at the end of the day, you could express yourself in a straightforward way. So it's not a simple one size fits all solution to any of these issues of communication. But again, it's an issue of just trying to find that right balance of being able to be really precise and very specific about what you say, and also to communicate in a way that takes the needs of the audience into account. And your traditional bad legalese, bad legal expression, of course, does neither of those things. It doesn't communicate with the audience, and it's not very precise. Those, the term hereinto, referred into, hereafter, as the term in the first part, in the second part kind of stuff, which no one has done for years, by the way. But those old things that you still see in old wills and things like that didn't achieve technical precision either. This is becoming an increasingly diverse issue, not just for lawyers and not just for people who work in the legal profession. And as we know, most lawyers don't work in the legal profession. But in terms of drafting regulatory instruments or rules, it becomes very important. And that's, again, a different sort of literacy. So even if you're in an environment where, say, there's a new set of workplace safety laws that have come into place, and your job is to create a document that you're going to send out to everyone who works in the environment to explain, in this particular context, what those safety laws mean, that has a whole lot of interesting things going on in terms of communication. And some of it's about using clear, easy to understand language. But there's also some really interesting issues around, the way in which you express yourself, the sequence with which you do things, the way in which you nest concepts within each other, the way in which you organise things, use subheadings. There's a whole lot of very interesting communication skills that we are only just sort of talking about at this point, very early part of your program, about those skills, but they become very, very important. And anyone who's tried to play, even like play a board game where the rules, are doing your head in, because you say, oh, I don't understand who goes, what happens then, what do we do, whatever, will know that there is a real skill at being able to draft rule systems that are approachable and understandable. Now that's something that is a career skill that is becoming more and more important, because we're becoming more and more heavily regulated, and we're in an environment where more and more people are having to make and apply rules. So I think this is one reason why, even though not many law graduates end up in the legal professions as such, there's still a big demand for law graduates, and it's a lot of I think they used to take business graduates back in the day, and now they'll say they'll take a law graduate in preference, because the world has become more heavily regulated. And this year we've seen a whole lot of different rules come into play around the virus, and who does what when, and when do you have to self-isolate, and how many people can you meet in what sort of place. And if you're like me, you've got an inbox of emails from different businesses and organisations that are all saying, this is how we're responding, and this is how we're implementing the rules. In our restaurant, we're no longer leaving cutlery in a communal area, and all those things. And you're getting all these statements. Now, these are the skills that are very contemporary 21st century skills. And these are things that suddenly people who don't have any kind of background in understanding rules or regulatory systems are suddenly having to do this. So I'm diverging quite a bit, as you can see from what the book's saying, and I think the book's very straightforward, and I think you'll read it and it'll say, don't use long words when you can use shorter words, and it's worth reading. I'm not saying it's not worth reading, but I'm saying it's not difficult or problematic. But I had a few issues here on my little notes that I wanted to talk about, that just to give you a bit more context on this topic and how it's changing, because the textbook is, in some ways, is very old-fashioned, very much reflects this old idea of what people do in their professional lives. And we are in an environment where we're increasingly got a technological basis of the way in which we communicate and collaborate. And in this unit, and soon in all your others, you'll be using a digital collaboration space, which is MS Teams. And that's the way in which we collaborate is changing. Email has been the default way that organisations have communicated for 20-something years now, and it's a disaster. People don't read emails is the end of the day, end of the story. And the building and creation of these digital collaboration spaces like Teams or Slack or whatever have been ways of trying to avoid the problems that came out of email. And one of the big problems that came out of email was we went from an environment where people, if they wanted to communicate with a group, and collaboration is based on communication, they would have to ring everyone up, or type up a memo and have it photocopied and have it physically distributed to people. Now that put a limit on the if you want to say the bandwidth of the information an organisation distributed. As soon as email came about, anyone could at any time send any number of messages, and because they could, they did. And we never ever evolved any kind of practice for filtering, or for being able to say, no, does everyone really need to know that, the tissue box in the common room on level 4 is now empty and someone needs to fix it, or whatever trivial stuff fills up your inbox. And those of you who are younger people, our research tells us, don't read email. And this is one of the reasons. Email is just seen as this endless pit of useless information that people do, often just to cover themselves, and it's just been this huge glut of information. So the next generation spaces, and I'm not sure Teams is the end of the story, Teams is definitely a stage of evolution, has been about finding ways to collaborate where information goes where it needs to go and is stored where it needs to be stored, so that people can access those things. So again, with my encouragement to get involved and get engaged and get doing things, get involved with teams and start learning the way in which these things work, the way in which you collaborate. I mean, you will have to do group assignments at some point in your studies, and I can hear everyone groaning already because everyone hates group assignments. And often they are constructed in a particularly poor way that means that some people do all the work and some people don't do any at all, and that's, I think, the heart of the problem. But and the textbook does give you some pointers on when that does happen. But on the other side of the coin, if you never ever get any experience in collaborating, it then becomes very difficult when you're put in a collaborative space. And you've got to, you rely on other people. Organisations are complex. Even in areas that used to be sort of individual-led, like architecture, used to be very much the genius architect would come up with the plan, and then that would go down through the organisation, and the drafters and engineers would develop up that plan. Have to tell the architect that it was unfeasible or whatever. But it was that in the era of modernism of the 20th century was one where, the genius individual or the, above average individual told everyone else what to do. 21st century architecture is usually very much team-based. And while they will often have like a team leader architect ascribed to a project, there's too much complexity involved for one person to be the architect, and anything that we do involves more and more levels of collaboration and complexity. So there's plenty to think about in this week. The other topic that comes up is the notion of negotiation, and I guess this is again one of those critiques of traditional roles in law and justice that were very much adversarial and were very much based on just telling people what to do, and it highlights the text highlights the importance of being able to negotiate and to actually work with others, and this is collaboration and communication again to create a solution. There's a lovely expression from negotiation when you learn to become a negotiator called a BATNA. A BATNA, which is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And it's a way of reality testing because people in arguments and disagreement tend to form into positions, and they don't like to compromise, and they feel as though any compromise they make weakens them. Whereas in reality, as a negotiator, that it's give and take, and it's often very, very powerful to be able to give ground on things you don't really care about in order to preserve the things you do know. And the BATNA is where you say to someone who's involved in a negotiation, and often it's a client, whether you're in the justice sector, in community justice, or you're a lawyer, what is the best alternative to a negotiation? And it's often the alternative is go to court. And then you have to reality check how much is it going to cost to go to court? What's the likely outcomes? Even if you win, what your best alternative is winning at court, you're still going to probably lose money. You may not even be able to recover what you're claiming from the other person. So learning to think in a negotiated way is very, very important. And I think there's a certain personality trait of people who are drawn to these areas of study that requires a bit of self-reflection and self-assessment, where you think, well, am I the kind of person who has to win at all costs? And that, particularly in the law, is a concept that is, valorized in film and TV and media. The lawyer who never gives in and then just always wins at the last minute through some sort of technicality In the justice field, we all know about the hero cops who never take crap from anyone, and they still complete the case after the chief suspended them and taken their badge and gun off of them, and they still go and solve the case. We encourage this kind of really bad behaviour through things that are exciting in our media, whereas the people who get things done in the professional world are people who are, you know, much less confrontational, much better at negotiation, and much better at saying, you know, at forecasting what the outcomes are and working with others. Even if these are people whose interests are in many ways opposed to you, that doesn't mean you don't collaborate with them to form and in many ways that's the most important area to collaborate, to actually create solutions and outcomes that benefit everyone. Because if they benefit everyone, they benefit you as well. So anyway, that's just been some, I guess, more high-level discussion on some of the concepts from this week's readings. As I said, I don't think there's anything terribly problematic in there for you. As usual, I would recommend College Info Geek for some of the extra videos and things on specific topics around sort of communication skills. And there's plenty of different resources on the internet for that. But as I said at the outset, the most important, you know, trick to learning any of these things is to get in and actually practice those skills in a safe environment where you can get help and feedback, and that's what we're all here for.